it's no good having passionate conviction myself about what needs to be done. It's got to be anchored in facts, whether it's climate, nature, the use of AI or risks around the financial crisis. It's no good sounding like a campaigner for something. You're a board member and you're part of the collective decision making to make that organization successful.
Welcome to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany, where business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers. Each episode, we have 3 items on the agenda: pressure, lessons, and boardroom dynamics. I'm Emily Sheffield, communication specialist, broadcaster, former newspaper editor, and board member. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with senior leaders to talk about what really goes on behind the boardroom doors when the pressure's on and the stakes are high. Joining me this week is Julie Baddeley. Julie is chair of the Chapter Zero Alliance, an organisation that enables directors to implement climate strategies that strengthen long-term organisational resilience and competitive advantage. There are now chapters in 74 countries. She co-founded the UK chapter when she was chair until 2025. Julie has sat on boards in executive and non-executive roles for 25 years across a range of sectors, including consumer, retail, financial services, and professional services. She spent 5 years as chairman of the global recruitment company Harvey Nash, was a director at the British bakery and fast food company Greggs, and was a non-executive director at a mortgage lender during the 2008 financial crisis. Welcome to the podcast, Julie.
Thank you.
Now, the first item on our agenda is boardroom pressure. Let's start with a financial crisis. And before we get into some of the detail, I wonder if you can paint a picture of what it was like just to be inside the boardroom of a mortgage lender at this time.
I mean, it was such an interesting time. And I think looking back on it, it's always different when you look back. It crept up on us. I mean, we were having a lot of conversations about the fact that consumers had borrowed too much. They'd leveraged their salaries far too far. People like capital economics were talking a lot about the risks around that. But the whole piece about investing in these very fancy financial instruments did really creep up on us, and everyone in the industry was doing it. And we were being presented at the board by all these sort of tables and bar charts, and they showed, how incredibly safe these instruments were and all this sort of thing. And it was very, very hard at the time to question whether all of this was the right way to go. And I'm talking, I guess I get my dates wrong these days, but I guess this would be 2008, would it? Early 2008, late 2007. And I wasn't a banker, so I didn't, had not got all that depth. And I just kept saying, but how much profit are we making out of these? And it wasn't very much. And so I said, well, why are we doing this? Why are we, taking these positions with quite substantial amounts of our members' money when it's all so uncertain, and we're having to go on courses as board members to understand how they work. And inevitably, the problem that you get in boards sometimes, which is sort of groupthink played in, where a lot of people who'd been in banking a long time, and the sort of feeling was, well, you don't really understand the fact that this is, everybody's doing this and they're making loads of money. But I did persist, and we did rein our approach right back, actually. So we survived, unlike some. But it was a real lesson for me, which really has played out, in the years subsequently, although it's quite a long while ago now, that being a long-term member of an industry doesn't necessarily mean the right things for the future. And that it's very easy for a board to slip into this sort of groupthink where everybody's reinforcing everybody else's thinking. And if you're an outlier, it's not a very comfortable place to be.
It's really hard to be a dissenting voice or quite a tough voice. How did you balance that? Because you're on the board. You are not the team. You are not the internal team. You are there to advise. I mean, it's different in finance. It's much tougher. The governance in around a mortgage lender, I'm sure, was much, much tougher in the board. But given probably sometimes you weren't very popular in that boardroom, my question is, how do you say a hard truth to a group of people who don't want to hear it? And how do you do it effectively?
Yeah, and I think I learnt a lot of lessons because I didn't probably do it terribly effectively initially. And, what I've learned is, for one thing, it's no good using rhetoric on any of these subjects. Whether it's climate and nature or, the use of AI or the financial risks around the financial crisis, it's no good sounding like a campaigner for something. You're a board member and you're part of the collective decision making to make that organization successful for all its stakeholders, not just for profit. And so one of the things I think I could have done better, and I've tried to do since, is to be sure of my facts. So rather than reacting to a presentation without really knowing the background properly, to actually really be on top of the subject, so that when you present these things, you can present them from a factual base. You can give examples from other industries, because let's face it, that's what non-execs bring to a board often, is experience of other industries. And in my case, real economy and financial services. So being able to bring in examples, being able to quote respected people who are saying the same sort of thing, and having a sort of fact base of evidence to present. Think of the climate world now, it's just the same. It's no good having passionate conviction myself about what needs to be done. It's got to be anchored in facts and business strategy and commercial reality.
Now let's move on to boardroom lessons and your work with the Chapter Zero Alliance. There are chapters all over the world. What are the big lessons you've learned from working with boards across the globe on the issue of climate change? Because that too can be a sort of thorny topic, especially now.
So when I started Chapter Zero in the UK, we had this notion, which has been proved correct, that this can only be tackled by business, this problem, and it can only be tackled by boards if it's going to be tackled by business, because it's such a big item that you need board support. You can't have executives going off, however passionate they might be about the topic. They can't go off without board endorsement because it's such a challenge to the status quo. And so we created this network of non-executive directors, first in the UK, and then we hooked up with the World Economic Forum and created the global network. The problem is that with any change program, you set the ambition, but then you hit the barriers and the roadblocks when you start really working on how to make that change. How do you allocate capital to this and not to that? How do you persuade staff to change the jobs that they're doing? And all the different things that a challenge to a whole business model will result in. From a Chapter Zero Alliance perspective, we have sort of two approaches, I suppose. The overarching approach is this is a business commercial issue. So we explore resilience and adaptation and opportunities.
How do you deal with boards more specifically on this? How are you persuading boards of keeping going? That is the challenge. Boards are switching off.
Well, you would think boards are switching off if you read a lot of the commentary, but actually an awful lot of them aren't. They're just doing it more quietly. So the way we deal with boards, and our members who are board members deal with their board, is to really frame the conversation around the normal board discussion. So it's about business strategy. It's about, as I say, building resilience and a sustainable business that can go forward, won't be knocked off course because its supply chain has collapsed. It's about having a much more intelligent way of looking at risk. Boards are very focused on risk. Audit committees are very focused on risk, but very few of them take a dynamic approach to risk, where they look at how all the different risks that they're facing sort of can amplify each other. That's what happened with the financial crisis, of course, thinking back to that. But the risks can amplify each other so that they're not linear. You can't just take a silo approach and say there's this risk and it's gone up that much and we've got this mitigation.
So really, you're going back to your early point is which you learnt on your first board, which is don't go in there with these sort of passionate activist arguments. Go in there with facts. Go in there with strategy, stuff that speaks to everybody sitting on that board, not just to the climate activist who might be on the board. You're making it part of their business strategy, and those are your clear, fact-driven arguments.
Yes, and it is the business strategy, because if you're in construction, your whole business is going to change over the next decade because of all of this. Whether you like it or not. If you're in food and agriculture, your whole business is going to change. So it is a real business strategy. And I think it was inevitable that climate became a sort of buzzword, if you like, to get attention. But actually, we're moving now, I think, much more into seeing this much more commercially.
But how does timing play in getting board members on board with certain issues or moving in a specific direction?
Timing is absolutely crucial in this, and especially in the boardroom, because if you don't get the conversation going at the right time, you can really go adrift. And I've had my own experience of that with a big food outlet chain, where I was very enthusiastic about the topic of vegetarian food and salads, healthy salads, and all that sort of stuff. I thought that was, a really important part of the offer. And for companies, you want to be ahead of the competition, but not so far ahead that you misstep and you trip over. And in this case, I was without any doubt too far ahead of the consumer, of the customer, and as a result, we had lots of wasted product because people just didn't buy the salads and they didn't want the vegetarian food. And it's sort of, the timing point is really illustrated by the fact that I stepped off the board after my 9 years or whatever. And it was within 2 years that the vegan sausage roll was the best-selling product for that company at Christmas. So it was probably good to raise it early because it got people sort of thinking, but it was too early in terms of pushing forward at speed.
Finally, it's boardroom dynamics. Now, you've sat on so many boards, chaired so many boards. Looking back over your very long career in the boardroom, could you think of a time where you really felt the boardroom dynamics were not working? And was there something personally you did as a board member or chair to try and solve those dynamics?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, a specific example I would go for is where I joined a board to find that, first of all, the board evaluation had been carried out, and it had given flying colours to every aspect. I mean, it was, in a score of 1 to 10, it was sort of 8, 9, 10s, every aspect. And because
You thought, red flag.
Well, I asked for it in advance because I always try to see what was said prior to joining, just to see, if people have said things like I've said in the past, like, it would be helpful to develop more time to strategy and less time to operational matters. If you see that, then you're sort of alert to it. So I joined the board to see and saw this. And within literally 2 meetings, it was obvious that, first of all, they wanted to get rid of the chief executive. And secondly, the chair was basically not letting anybody have a discussion, really. It was just damped down. Every discussion point was damped down.
Top down.
Yeah. And I think that was a sort of that, but if I think back 25 years when I started, it was very much like that. My very first board, you sat in order of whether you when you joined the board, and the newest person was the furthest away from the chairman, and it was a great long table, and it was so formal and so
Oh
orchestrated.
my God.
Not like that at all at the moment, not like that.
That feels so old-fashioned now, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it's so old-fashioned. You just wouldn't believe it now. But now there's so much more debate, but that makes chairing even more important. And on what I did with that board specifically was I went to the SID and the one of the other independent directors who'd been around quite a long while, and I said, look, this isn't right. We've got to have a sort of joint approach to try to free this up and get a better conversation going. But it's I just cannot emphasize enough how important the role of the chair is. And if you're someone who is trying to sometimes present an alternative point of view, which I think is what board members need to be able to do, not all the time, but just to bring that fresh perspective or challenge the status quo, you need the chairman to give you the airtime to do that, and not drown you out with voices of people who've been in the sector for the last 20 years and think everything's going to, keep going the way it always has, because it isn't. Everything is changing.
As both a chair and a board member, because I think this is an interesting one I've come across, is in my experience, if you are a dissenting voice, how much do you think, both from a chair perspective and the board member who wants to bring up something quite tricky, do you think it's worth having a little chat with the chair beforehand and saying, listen, I'm a little uncomfortable. I've got to bring this up. I'm worried about it. Or do you think you just have to sort of plow in the boardroom? I think every board is very different. You probably have to figure that out. But what would be your advice from the perspective of being a chair, very experienced chair, and having been that dissenting voice on a board?
Dissenting voice is quite a sort of powerful statement. I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that I've always got lots of dissent to bring. Sometimes it's just a case of thinking, actually, that point that's in the papers, I'm not quite comfortable with that. It's more at that sort of level. And I would always, if I could, share with the chair in advance if you're going to raise a point that has an element of challenge to what the executives are putting forward, because I think the chair needs to be able to prepare for that. I don't think you get any advantage from blindsiding anyone in these things. You want, prepare the ground a bit, talk to the chief executive, because maybe you've misunderstood. I've certainly had experiences where I've just misunderstood what they're saying because they're deep specialists. I'm not. And the chief executive has explained it and the point has gone away.
I've always found sometimes it's helpful to phrase things as questions as well, rather than a statement. I was wondering whether, what did you think, this, that, and the other? Having done my homework, obviously, but it feels less aggressive, doesn't it, if you just raise it as a question, a pointed question. But it can disarm people, can't it?
Absolutely. It's all about questions, not about statements. And I, if I think the topic's going to be, there's some difficult topics and there's a lot on the agenda, so not much time, I will actually plan those questions in advance. We're all about asking questions, and it's just making sure you get the right ones.
Yeah. And then seeing what the answer is. And sometimes not even reacting, just let other people react to the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very good advice. Very good advice. On a different subject, but still on boardroom dynamics, you chaired a board through the process of going from public to privately owned. For anyone, I know a number of people who either own companies or are sitting on boards who are looking at that, going through that at the moment. What advice would you give? Because it's either going public or reverse. These are huge moments for boards and companies.
Yeah, I think that's the time when the chair particularly, but all the board members really have to roll up their sleeves and put the time in. I mean, as the chair, in my situation, there wasn't an aligned view on the board on whether the approach should be explored. But we also had an activist investor on the board, a representative. So we had some quite difficult discussions that, had to be navigated quite carefully. And so what I found was that you had to really spend quite a lot of time with the different directors, understanding their position. And I've been through one recently, which I wasn't chairing, where they set up an extremely effective committee, to deal with this, with the audit chair and one or two key directors on it, so you could put additional time in and they could bring their recommendation back to the board. But I think you need to align everybody in the end. And obviously there comes a point where you probably have to consult shareholders, which is not the easiest of things sometimes to do, because they all have very, very different views on what's the right answer, all based on what will give them the best return or the best result. And particularly when you've got a investor on the board, they've obviously got a particular objective in mind. So I think it's about talking to people and trying to build a consensus. But then if you can't get that consensus, then obviously that's the one instance where sometimes boards have to go without everybody being 100% behind.
Julie, it's been such a pleasure hearing your stories and insights. Now, we always like to finish with one final question. If you could go back to your first board meeting, what would you tell yourself?
I would tell myself to pick my battles carefully, really be clear about the priorities, because it's very easy, particularly for someone like me who spent a lot of my life as a consultant. It's very easy to see all the problems. And if you see all the problems, you don't get any action on any of them. So being very clear, what are the things that are really worth exploring and questioning your words, using the right questions and doing it through a commercial lens and, with a good fact base to support those questions. Because when you go onto a board, it's the whole thing about making a first impression. Really, you set a tone for how you're going to operate in those early meetings, and you want them to see you as credible and knowledgeable, but also challenging and supporting and challenging at the same time.
All at the same time. Julie Baddeley, thank you so much for sharing your boardroom stories with us, and also congratulations on Chapter Zero Alliance. That's a huge achievement what you've done, and we're really grateful for you giving us your time and commitment today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany. Sherpany is a leading meeting management solution designed to meet the unique needs of the board committee and executive meetings. Find out more at sherpany.com and make sure you subscribe to the Boardroom Confidential podcast to hear more business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers.